All right, the chapter for this week that I've asked you to read deals with the Western Hemisphere, with the New World, in the aftermath of the explorations of Columbus and other Portuguese and Spanish mariners. I'm going to talk primarily today about something that may at first seem to be quite remote from this, but in fact I don't think it is, because it speaks to the very broad question of how do we consider the Eastern Hemisphere and the Western Hemisphere in world history. Not speaking specifically about the 16th century or the 15th century or any other century, but just how do these two parts of the world sort out? When you are dealing with this as an author of a textbook, it often comes down to the question of in what chapter do you first mention the Western Hemisphere civilizations? Some people say you should mention them, let us say, by chapter 3 or 4, because you have many students of Hispanic heritage in high schools, and they will feel diminished if their part of the world doesn't get mentioned early on. The same argument, of course, is made for when should you first mention Africa. So that is kind of a sociological argument based on what are perhaps incorrect assumptions about student anticipation. Then there's the idea that you should mention them, that you should sort of give the Western Hemisphere in the pre-Columbian era as sort of a gestalt, as a big picture, where you start at the beginning, you end up with the Incas and the Aztecs, and you do it all at once. But then the problem with that is if you put that early in the book, and the Incas and the Aztecs are in power when the Spaniards come circa 1500 AD, then the chapter goes too far forward and it's jumping the gun chronologically. So then a third option is to put the stuff, the broad portrayal of the Western Hemisphere just before the voyages of exploration, so that you're prepared for what the Spaniards and the Portuguese will find when they get there. And then there's a fourth option, which is to divide the coverage into 2 or 3 different chunks, which is something that teachers don't like, because they prefer to deal with large, fairly homogeneous chunks, as opposed to more of a selected short subjects approach to things. I'm going to adopt a different approach today. It's one I've spent the last couple of months working on, which I hope will end up being the seed of a short book. And it deals with the question of where did civilization begin and when did civilization begin? And what was civilization? When we approach this topic, in every world history textbook that I know of, we say that civilization began in the river valleys of Egypt and Mesopotamia. And we often throw in the Indus River Valley in what is now southern Pakistan, although some people will put that in a separate chapter. But by and large, civilization starts in the Old World river valleys. And it starts somewhere around 3500 BC, although you get a running start going back to, say, 5000 or so, when you look at the late Neolithic communities that emerge as civilizations. And you also point out that the earliest city that has been continuously inhabited in the Old World is Jericho, for which you have a timeline that goes back to about 9000 BC. So we've had civilization for a long time in the Old World. In the New World, the earliest civilizations that are thought of as full-fledged civilizations, that is to say ones that have intensive agriculture, urban development, social stratification, division of labor, luxury artistic production, giant monumental buildings and so forth. We usually identify these as the Olmecs in southern Mexico and the Chavin in northern Peru. The Olmecs you may well have run into because they did some really nifty sculpture. The Chavin you probably have not run into. But they're about the same time. They usually date around 1500 BC. In other words, 2,000 years later than what you have in Egypt and Mesopotamia, where we're talking about 3,500 BC. So nobody really questions the idea that the earliest civilizations are those in Egypt and Mesopotamia. But of course, this comes from counting backward from the present. You're saying, what are the earliest civilizations relative to today? And you go back and that's what you get. Now, if you turn it around and you say, when did modern humans, Homo sapiens sapiens, the species we all belong to, when did they first become the resident population in different parts of the world? Then we get a very different story. Homo sapiens sapiens is thought to come into being, say, 50 to 60,000 years ago in East Africa, sort of parts of what today would be Ethiopia and Somalia. Let's just say 50,000 years ago, because it's such a nice round number. Modern humans left Africa. This is during an ice age, although that wasn't a big deal for Africa. There were no glaciers or anything. But they left Africa, and they arrived in Australia by 40,000 years ago. So it took 10,000 years for them to get from East Africa to Australia, and about the same amount of time for them to get to Europe. Although the distance between Europe and East Africa is only about, maybe 20% of the distance between East Africa and Australia. So those who ended up in Australia really scampered. They moved along and they ended up in Australia. And those in Europe, well, just took them a long time to find their way, maps or anything like that. But there should be some explanation for it, but we don't care about that because we're talking about 40,000 years ago. There were modern humans in Egypt and Mesopotamia. Now, when it comes to southern Mexico and Peru, there's virtually no scientific opinion that maintains that modern humans arrived in southern Mexico or Peru more than 15,000 years ago. So in other words, 40,000 years ago, in the old world, in the areas that become civilized first, and 15,000 years ago, being generous, in the areas that become civilized in the New World. So now you have dates to count forward from. You can say, how long did it take to go from, let me make this 40,000 just to round it off a little. How long did it take to go from the first modern humans in the Middle East and Egypt to the first urban site that we know of? Well, 31,000 years. The first urban site in the New World was the site of Corral on the Peruvian coast. And they got there in, they're in Peru in 15,000, let's say. They have a city by 2600 BC. So here we have an elapsed time, 31,000 years. If my math is wrong, correct me. And here we have an elapsed time of, let's say, 12,400 years. Then we have full-fledged civilization comes along 1,100 years later. And here, full-fledged civilization comes along 5,500 years later. And you look at it counting forward and you say, what is taking those people in the old world so damn long to create civilization? The earliest civilizations are in the old world, but the most precocious civilizations are in the New World. Now, no one ever talks about this. I haven't found anyone who's willing to even debate it, and yet nobody disagrees on the numbers. You can disagree on the question of what is a civilization. But even there, most of the old world archaeologists are willing to grant that they did have civilizations in the New World, and that they're roughly in the timetable that is suggested. So whatever was happening in the New World was just going much, much, much faster than whatever was happening in the Old World. Now, in the Old World, we have archaeology that has produced a very elaborate and impressive story. You have a Neolithic revolution that comes sometime around 10,000 BC or so, when little bitty sharp stones that are found on sites are evidence that they put the stones in a wooden frame and used this sickle with sharp stones to cut down the straws in fields of wild grain. Then we have evidence that wheat and barley became domestic crops at roughly that time, and we can tell what mutations were necessary, particularly for wheat, just one mutation in order to go from wild wheat to domestic wheat. Then you have further mutations after that. So we get the Neolithic stone tools. Then we get the evidence of grain cultivation, domestication. Then we get, roughly simultaneously, the evidence that sheep and goats and cows are becoming domestic. And so we have the invention of farming and herding, this great leap forward on the basis of which, after only a few thousand more years, from 10,000 to 3,500, after only a few thousand more years, this ripens into civilization. This is considered the primary story of the extraordinary capability of our species. This is what we did. We had powers of innovation and creativity that were so great that we were able to go from Paleolithic stone tools that were little more than chunks of rock we picked up, around the campsite, to full-fledged urban civilization in a matter of only 36,500 years. Now, some people have questioned that. They said, what were people doing for 35,000 years? Sitting on their thumbs? I mean, if we were so creative and innovative, why did it take so long? And this is what is called, there's an English archaeologist named Colin Renfrew, and he has called this the sapient paradox. If sapiens, Homo sapiens sapiens, sapien meaning knowing things, if the humans that came into being at the time we think our species originated, and we've had no profound changes in our mental capacities since that time, if they came into being 50,000 years ago, then their capability conceptually to create civilization must have been there latent for 30, 40,000 years before it dawned on them to say, wheat, what we need is to eat this wheat and domesticate it and get that sheep over here because we're going to eat it too. The sapient paradox was that it took so long. A paradox, you know how, you have the innate ability to create civilization, and yet you can't seem to pull the trigger for such a very long time. That's the sapient paradox. Now the problem with it, of course, is that in southern Mexico and Peru, they pulled the trigger so much earlier, so much faster. The people who came in 15,000 BC, by the common consensus of pretty much all archaeologists, had no greater knowledge of tools or cultural attainments than the people who showed up in the Middle East 40,000 years ago. In other words, there was no head start. You look at the earliest stone tools that you have in the Western Hemisphere, say the Clovis culture of the Southwest United States, and those stone tools look just about like the same stone tools for the same period in Europe. In addition, DNA analysis has pretty much confirmed that the Paleo-Indians, that is to say the first modern human inhabitants of the Western Hemisphere, were descended genetically from people who lived in northeastern Asia and Siberia, and whose relatives are still living there. And these relatives are people like the Chukchis and the Koryaks. Neither a household name when chatting on the subject of civilization, because Northeast Asia never does make a move to civilization. So it's very hard to claim that the people who came to the New World had a head start. So instead you have the problem of how did they get to civilization so fast? And how did the people in the Old World take so much time to get to the same stage, even though in the Old World they got there earlier in pure chronological terms? There is no absolute way of answering this. But let me start by suggesting some things. First of all, when you take the original Homo sapiens sapiens in East Africa, they are the descendants of earlier species of hominins going back to Australopithecus that had all lived in Eastern Africa. It is reasonable to assume that in their home territory there were some animals that really liked to eat people, because humans are not at the top of the food chain. We don't have any teeth, we don't have any claws worth talking about. Until we figured out how to throw stones, we couldn't kill big animals, but we were pretty easy prey. If somebody wanted to eat one of us, what were we going to do? Say, actually, I'm equipped with speech, so I can tell you, do not do not attack me, Mr. Lion, because I'm a human. I'm equipped with speech, and I can talk you to death. Now, so you have to assume that as in virtually every other situation in the world, you had a coevolution of predator species and prey species, that somebody ate people, and probably kept the population in check. Because that's what we find in prey-predator relationships around the globe, is that you have coevolution of species in which the number of predators and the number of prey are in a kind of balance. Too many of the prey get eaten, the predators die because their food is gone. Not enough of them get eaten, then you get more predators being born. So somebody was eating people. We don't have any evidence of who that is. Could have been the lions out on the savannah. If I were a lion and I could bring down a giraffe or an okapi or an eland or something, I wouldn't go after a human. It's maybe appetizer-sized meal, but it's not the sort of thing I'm going to do as a lion. The likelihood, in my view, and in the view of the one anthropologist who's really put me onto this, is that people were eaten by hyenas. The anthropologist who's written about this has argued that hyenas, uniquely among the native East African predators, prefer to have their dens where people live. Instead of being a predator that stays away from people, the hyenas like to stay where the people are, and the hyenas are nocturnal. So they stay in a den during the day, and at night they come out and they eat the boys and girls and the oldsters that they can get their teeth on. Plus, hyenas are unbelievably ferocious. I had the pleasure of visiting a hyena research facility at Berkeley a couple of years ago, and they're just terribly ferocious animals. And one thing that's very special about them is that when they eat you, they eat the bones. They just crunch up the whole thing. So their feces are bright white because they are excreting the calcium of all the bones they chewed up. And I saw, they give the neck bone of a pig, push it through the slot, and this hyena comes and simply crunches it up and eats the whole thing. Particularly the female, because the females dominate. And they feed the female first, and then they try and give something to the male somewhere else so he won't be left out, because the females will steal the food from the males. They're terribly ferocious animals. Okay, maybe they're hyenas, maybe not. But if you move out of the territory where you have a natural predator, you're going to live longer. Because the predators into whose territory you're moving, have co-evolved with other species, not with you in particular. So you go into India and you find, well, tigers will eat humans, but frankly, they prefer to eat a nilgai or a water buffalo or something. That's what they grew up with. Humans are sort of the new prey on the block. So the reason the reason there are so few hominin remains in East Africa is that most of the people were chewed up by the hyenas and left as little deposits of hyena dropping. Now, humans could not easily move out of this environment so long as they were living on plants. The problem is that any species that is primarily herbivorous knows what plants they can eat and what plants they can't. They acquire this, essentially through cultural processes over generations. Most plants you cannot eat. You either cannot digest it, or it will poison you, or it tastes terrible. So it's a fairly small number of species of plants in any environment can be eaten. So if you move out of your native habitat, you have the problem that you're going into an area where there are new plants, and you don't know which ones you can eat. That some might look like the old plants, but then you eat it and you die, and you say, oh, that was a mistake. And there must have been a lot of experiment like that. Do you remember so-and-so? He ate that. He's dead. So now we know we don't eat that. But that takes a long time to learn. So when you move out of your home environment, it's very important to be a carnivore, because for all intents and purposes, all flesh is edible. So it is tool making, the ability to acquire meat and to prefer meat, that precedes the moving of humans out of Africa. Now, we define that primarily as hunting. And we support this because we collect stones that have been chipped into hand axes or spear points or something, and we say this is what they hunted with. But the likelihood is that it wasn't the hunting that led people out, but rather the fishing. When you look at people going from East Africa to Australia, far more rapidly than they were able to go from East Africa to France. How did they get to Australia so fast? And the answer almost certainly is that they followed the coastline. At that time, the sea level was about 400 feet lower than it is now. As a result, you could go from East Africa all the way to Borneo and only have to cross one body of salt water. There's a very narrow strait between Yemen and Africa that is still there. It's bigger now, and you would have to cross that. But otherwise, you could simply walk along the coast from Somalia to Borneo without having to cross any salt water. Then when you got to Borneo, you would have to cross another body of water in order to get to Australia. So certainly there was some water that was crossed. But at that time, Southeast Asia was a subcontinent. All the islands of Indonesia, the Philippines, they were all connected by dry land. It was just a subcontinent. And Australia and New Guinea were a whole continent. If humans followed the coastline, followed the fish, all the way to Australia, it would leave virtually no trace. Because once the Ice Age ended and the sea level rose again, the whole coastal areas were flooded. So any archaeological remains are now underwater. For example, the entire Persian Gulf was dry land at that time. And archaeologists now assume that early human habitation in that area is underwater. It's in the Persian Gulf. So we have a very hard time proving that was the way people traveled. And yet, there is a new scientific technique that has been adopted to test this sort of hypothesis. This has to do with the analysis of an isotope, of two isotopes of nitrogen, isotope 14 and isotope 15. Nitrogen only has two stable isotopes. And so nitrogen 14 and nitrogen 15 show up together in the atmosphere. They show up together in plants that are capable of binding nitrogen, or bacteria that are capable of binding nitrogen. That is, say, taking nitrogen out of the air or out of the soil and turning them into plant tissues. Animals cannot directly bind nitrogen, although maybe some bacteria in an animal could. But by and large, this is what plants do, is that they take nitrogen out of the atmosphere And whatever nitrogen ends up in human tissues comes ultimately from eating plants. The ratio between nitrogen 14 and nitrogen 15 in a given area is considered to be pretty much a constant. That is to say, the ratio in the atmosphere. Whether it's always been a constant is hard to tell, but it's generally assumed that this has been a constant component of air throughout geological times. When a plant takes in nitrogen, then it takes in the two forms, nitrogen 15 and nitrogen 14. Animals, for reasons that have still not been finally determined, animals seem to excrete more nitrogen 14 than nitrogen 15. That means that in a given area, if you measure the nitrogen 15 in plants from the area, whether plants today or archaeologically, you can say, let us say the plants have a level of 6. Then you say, well, but the cows have a level of 11 because they retain more nitrogen 15 than the plants do. Then you look at the lions that eat the cows and you say, well, that's the next, in a food chain, each level is called a trophic level. So that cows eat plants, lions eat cows. Those are different trophic levels. Trophic refers to, from a Greek root meaning food. So then you'll find that if the plants were 6 and the cows were 11, the lions will be 14. They'll have more nitrogen 15 than the cows, who in turn will have more nitrogen 15 than the plants. If you are in a marine environment or a freshwater environment, you have many more trophic levels than you have in a terrestrial environment. That is to say, there are big fish eat smaller fish, which eat smaller fish, which eat smaller fish, all the way down to the bottom where you have phytoplankton or something like that being consumed. So it turns out that the highest levels of nitrogen 15 are in the fish, particularly in those fish that are at the top of the food chain. The same fish, for example, that accumulate mercury for exactly the same reasons, that they're at the top of the trophic tree. So let us say you take from an archaeological site, you take some sheep bones, let's say domestic sheep, you figure humans eat the sheep, and then you take some human bones and you compare the nitrogen levels. Do the humans have the same nitrogen level as the sheep? Probably not. There'll be a little more because they're eating the sheep, but they're also eating vegetables. But if they have a lot more nitrogen, it means they're eating a lot of fish. And what has been found in different areas, though this is still a fairly new field of archaeology, is that in regions where we have always thought that herd animals were the primary resource for humans, who were herders and hunters, you'd say, let's say Ukraine or Romania back between 4 and 5,000 BC. If you look at the nitrogen levels, you find out that even though the people living there were herders, and even though they had hunting, and they had tools for all this, it appears that over 50% of all of their protein came from eating fish. It was the rivers that flowed into the Black Sea, like the Danube and the Pruth and the Bug and the Dniester and the Dnieper and the Don, the whole crowd of rivers. This is where people were getting their food. And why? Well, it's an awful lot easier to catch a fish than to catch an antelope. For one thing, the fish tend to come to you you're standing there by the stream, fish swims by. The antelope run away from you. You have to chase the antelope. If bears can live on salmon, simply going, whoop, I got a salmon, why couldn't people just go, whoop, look, bluefish, whoop, lionfish, So we don't know. But it seems likely that fish is the clue. Now this helps understand why people who walked all the way across from East Africa over a period of 10,000 years to Australia also went up the coast of Asia to Siberia and crossed over into Alaska somewhere, say, between 14 and 16,000 years ago. Because they're following the coast. And cold waters have abundant fish resources. So they probably were not crossing from Siberia into Alaska chasing reindeer or hunting for seals. They're probably following the fish along the coast. And once they got to North America, well, hey, just go down the Pacific coast. Pretty soon you're in prime salmon territory. Alaska salmon, then, state of Washington salmon. I presume the Canadians have salmon too, but you never hear about it. Then you get down farther, San Diego's tuna fishing industry. And finally you get down to the world's most abundant fishery, which is the coast of Peru. And southern Mexico, the Pacific coast of southern Mexico, is not quite as well endowed as the coast of Peru. But this is the great fishery. And that is where people ended up. Despite the fact that the land on the coast of Peru was an extremely dry desert. So by this theory, people were more interested in eating the fish, though some of them were going inland and hunting other animals, certainly. Got to catch those mammoths and woolly rhinoceri and so on. But a lot of people were getting fish, and then after they had established themselves, then they looked around for plants to eat. All right. Why did people do this? A fundamental assumption of the theory that I'm presenting here is that people, and by people I mean primarily men, don't like to be around other people very much. That, they say, I'd like to go out in the woods, or get a sailboat and go sailing, or have a summer place, or, maybe just, live in a cargo container or something. I mean, or a piano box. I mean, I just don't like people very much. There is scarcely a man alive, I think, who has not thought, I would like to get away from all these people and go out and simply be a man. When I taught a course on domestic animals, I'd ask students, how would you kill an animal if you didn't have anything but your bare hands? You hadn't invented any stone tools yet. And the football players who really liked the course, they'd say, well, I grab it by the horns, I wrench the neck like this, I break its neck. And I'd say, okay, now you've broken the neck of this poor, sad beast. How do you get inside if you don't have anything to cut with? Well, that would always be a puzzle. Because, leather is tough to get through. So then we'd end up talking about eating eyeballs and testicles and other soft parts, and the discussion deteriorated from there. But the thing is that it appears that Homo sapiens sapiens as a species contains one gender that prefers to go off to new territory rather than stay home and fight with the neighbors. The dispersal of humans around the world I think, cannot be explained in any other way. Somebody wanted to go someplace new. And of course, it means that there were people who saw really cool things for the first time. Not for the first time of anyone in their hometown, for the first time of any human at all. They got that, it was adventure. So they roamed far afield. They did not stay home and fight over their territory. Some did probably, but enough did not that you had these adventurers going everywhere. In other words, I'm taking a stand against the Hobbesian notion of the war of all against all, where you have my bit of land and you have your bit of land and let's fight and I'll take your land, you take my land. I don't think that occurred. I think they spread out. How else can we account for them appearing every place? Why is that important? That's important when you look at this terribly unequal timetable. If you look at a world, well, first of all, let me just make a remark sort of by the side, which is something I lectured on last year, which is that the early civilizations in the old world, in the river valleys of Egypt, Mesopotamia, Pakistan, and a bit later in China, those river valleys are all north of the Tropic of Cancer. They're in what is technically called the temperate zone, even though they're very hot, at least the non-Chinese ones. The tropical zone between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn does not have any early Old World civilizations. Thinkers going back to ancient Greece and Iran thought that it was simply too hot down in the tropics to have civilization. And by and large, this has been sort of tacitly echoed by later historians. If you look at the Western Hemisphere, at the New World, all of the early civilizations are in the tropics. From Peru up to Mexico, you're dealing with the area between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn. These are all tropical civilizations. Why would the single species to which we all belong really like the tropics in one hemisphere and, you know, in order to make it their civilizational home, whereas in the other hemisphere they avoid the tropics, seemingly. One of the recent general historians who's attempted to explain why the West is ahead of the rest of the world, Ian Morris, has solved this by inventing the phrase, the lucky latitudes. It says the lucky latitudes in the old world were, say, between 22 and 40 degrees north latitude, while the lucky latitudes in the Western Hemisphere were between, say, 22 south latitude and 22 north latitude. They're the lucky latitudes. I don't like to refer to a senior colleague at another university as being stupid, but this really is not a constructive way to approach things, is to say, well, this is the way it was, so let's simply say it was just luck. If you look at the tropics in the New World on a map, and you don't need a map just keep it in your head, the one thing you find is that the space in the New World tropics is physically the most restricted space anywhere on the globe, particularly if you assume a sea level that was much lower than it is now, so that Southeast Asia was all dry land, as opposed to divided up into the Malay Peninsula and the islands of Southeast Asia. This was the narrowest area. Southern Mexico through Central America and then down the Peruvian coast between the Pacific Ocean and the Andes. And that's a very narrow band of territory. If you look at the tropical areas in the Old World, what you find is they're enormously broad. To go from Senegal across to East Africa, then you hop, skip, and jump over the strait to Yemen. You go across Arabia, southern Iran, India, down to Southeast Asia. There is no limit on where you can go. The space of the Afro-Eurasian Eastern Hemisphere landmass is enormous, and the Australian landmass is very substantial, particularly if you compare it to Peru or to Panama or Guatemala. These are very narrow spaces. So this raises the question as to whether the triggering factor in the birth of civilization was spatial. Did the narrowness of space, the disappearance of new land to disperse into, force people into patterns of cooperation and conflict that gave rise to settled life, agriculture, civilization, and so forth? This would explain what happened in these very precocious civilizational developments in the New World. How would it do for the Old World? Well, in the Old World, basically, the period of civilizational development is between 5,000 and 3,500 BC, where you have Egypt and Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley becoming the seed beds for civilizations. That happens to coincide with a period of dramatic desiccation of the climate. These areas dried up in an extraordinary fashion, starting around 5,000 BC. In other words, if you go back to 6,000 BC, the Sahara Desert was a big grassy plain with mountains and wild animals. We have rock carvings from the middle of the Sahara Desert that show the big game that was once hunted in the Central Sahara. Pictures of elephants, pictures of hippopotamus, pictures of crocodiles. The Sahara was one of the really nice parts of the world, and had huge rivers running through it. You can fly over the Sahara now and see these old river valleys full of sand. By 2500 BC, there was no water left in the Sahara Desert. Completely dried up. It had reached, by 2500 BC, it had reached the level of dryness that it has today. And I tell you, say if you've been to the American Southwest and you think you've seen a desert, go to the Sahara and see what a real desert is like. It is unbelievably barren. I remember thinking, oh, that powder, it's so fine. Is it really sand? So I said, well, I'll just dampen my finger and put some oh, it's sand. Now I have sand in my mouth. Why? What a stupid thing to do. How do I get the sand out of my mouth? But really, in the Sahara, the sand is often like talcum powder. It is so fine and hangs in the air. And it's just nothing like it in the deserts we're more familiar with in this country. Arabia dried up during this time. The Middle East dried up in general. After all, Iraq and Syria are sort of the northern extensions of the Arabian Peninsula. Southern Pakistan, the province of Sindh, dried up at this time. Northwest India, the Rajasthan Desert, the Rann of Kutch area, they dried up at this time. As these areas dried up, all of which had people living in them, there was less and less game to hunt. less and less possibility of foraging for plants because the plants were dying out. What you had were river valleys that became functional isthmuses. You had, instead of in say, Panama, if you go to the west, you're in the Pacific Ocean. You go to the east, you're in the Caribbean Sea. In Egypt, if you go to the west, you're in the desert. If you go to the east, you're in the desert. You can't live in either place, whether it's a desert or whether it is an ocean. You are locked into that river valley. So what happens in the old world is that the people are there earlier, but the isthmuses are not. And it's the appearance of the isthmuses that triggers the increase in density that generates patterns of cooperation and conflict that lead on to civilization. It is likely that another attraction of these big river valleys was that they were full of fish. Because you have, in the desert, there are just fewer and fewer animals to hunt. But the river valleys had fish. Since we have not had nitrogen-15 analyses of bone collagen from these areas early on, I don't have any actual data on this. This is just a surmise on my part. Okay, so that is the isthmus theory of civilization. That says that in world history, we should, from the very beginning, talk about humans and space. How did the globe come to be inhabited? And what kinds of opportunities or constraints came about? In many parts of the world, as population density increased, people domesticated the local plants, but did not necessarily take the next step of rising to civilization. Because we are so fixated on the Neolithic revolution and those little bitty sharp stones, we tend not to pay much attention to plants other than grain plants. So if you say 10,000 years ago, wheat and barley were being grown in southern Turkey on the hilly flanks of the Taurus Mountains, you say, that's where civilization is going to begin. But 10,000 years ago, in New Guinea, remains from a site known as the Cook Swamp have shown that taro root, bananas, and sweet potatoes were all being grown artificially on cultivated plots. And manioc and certain other root crops, potatoes, go back to similar early roots. We have tended not to pay attention to crops that are not grain crops because those are not the ones that led to Egypt and Mesopotamia. On the other hand, the idea that grain crops are better than other crops really isn't very supportable. I just mentioned the book by Ian Morris. In one section of it, it's called Why the West is Ahead, ... for now. And he says, well, of the 54 grasses that have the largest seeds, something like 35 of them are found in the Middle East, of which some of them, like wheat and barley and rye, become cultivated plants. And he says, and grains are the most important food crop around the world. You know, wheat, barley, corn, rice, and sorghum. I thought, well, there was no rice in the Middle East. That's from India. There was certainly no corn in the Middle East. That's from Mexico. Sorghum comes from either China or Africa. There's some debate on sorghum. And nobody eats barley anymore. Beef barley soup, okay, occasionally you have it. Fortunately, we drink beer, and so we have some use for barley. But by and large, people a long time ago quit eating barley because they didn't like it very much. So of those great grain crops from the Fertile Crescent, only one of them really makes it down to modern times as a key crop, and that's wheat. In terms of acreage, wheat is not necessarily the most abundant crop. In the United States, both corn and soybeans have more acreage than wheat. So I think we have vastly overplayed the importance of wheat and barley because we're the descendants of the people who started out eating wheat and barley. And indeed, we're the descendants of civilized people. We have to surely honor civilization in that respect. Now, you have to understand that wheat and barley were terribly non-nutritious. Everybody agrees that civilization coincides with a substantial decline in the health of the people who were eating these first domesticated crops. Archaeologically, one of the markers you have if you find a human skull, you see whether there are any cavities in the teeth, because the foragers, the hunters and gatherers, never have cavities, but if you ate grain as your primary staple, you develop cavities. The size of humans was smaller with civilization. The fact of the matter is that civilization was not good for most people in health terms. For the top 2%, among whom, fortunately, everyone at Columbia is now numbered, for the top 2%, civilization was really, 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 really good and led to wonderful things. But the fact of the matter is that most people who live in civilized societies today do not live very good lives. And they haven't lived good lives for the last 8,000 years, 5,000 years. All right. So there's a question as to whether, you see, the reason I'm stressing this and perhaps exaggerating it, I'll say certainly exaggerating it, is that the assumption when people write about civilization is that civilization was really a great discovery, a big leap forward. Humans, after this long sapient paradox of twiddling their thumbs, suddenly they got their act together and created civilization, and everything has been wonderful ever since. But if you switch to the isthmus theory, then you say civilization comes about not because it's a huge creative leap forward to be universally applauded, but because it's a necessity caused by the disappearance of Lebensraum, of space to live. And that's the reason it occurs more precociously in the New World tropics, where space is the most limited, and in only a rather dilatory fashion in the Old World temperate zone, when the fluke of climate change caused these huge deserts to open up and force people into greater densities of population. One final piece of this is that the Old World got the domestic animals. This is taken, particularly by Jared Diamond, as being an example of really good luck, because only, by different people's counts, only 14 or 20 species of animals are capable of being domesticated. And the key ones, the cattle, the sheep, the goats, the pigs, lived in the Middle East. And therefore, this was a huge advantage to them. But the problem here is that when the countryside was drying up, these wild animals, where were they going to get their food? Because their food resources were disappearing. The plants were all dying, the lakes, the streams were all drying up. Where were they going to go? They're going to go into the river valleys or other places where you still had some rainfall. What are they going to eat? They're going to eat grass, which is, usually they'll select grass on the menu. Who is growing grass? People are growing grass. So in fact, the humans who devised this notion of using wheat and barley as staple crops were in competition with the animals because those animals were inclined to eat the crops that the humans were growing. There's a direct competition. What do you do when you're in competition with an animal species? If you're a human, you can do one of three things. You can kill all of them, and that's always a human favorite, to kill off the competing species. Or you can take the species and move them somewhere else, away from your crops. This is what we call pastoral nomadism, where you have specialists who go out and herd the animals and keep them away from the wheat and barley fields. Or you can domesticate them, which means that you're keeping some of them captive. Different theories on why they're kept captive. My own theory is that it was for purposes of religious sacrifice rather than as a basic meat supply, but other people will disagree on that. But the one thing that there is agreement on is that the animals that were kept captive are, particularly those from the bovine family, are way smaller than the wild examples of the same species. The reason is that the humans who captured them and held them in pens fed them straw but did not feed them grain, because they wanted the grain themselves. So these first domestic animals were malnourished and were kept away from the fields by being penned up. In the New World tropics, there were no competing animals. There were, if you were growing manioc or potatoes or beans or squash, you weren't worrying about a herd of cows coming in and eating everything you had, because you didn't have any large animals that were competing for you. Another reason you could move your civilization ahead faster. Another consideration here is that some of the most virulent diseases that humans have ever had have come about by the transfer of pathogens from domestic animals that they live with to human populations. We think of swine flu and avian flu, but tuberculosis comes originally from cows, apparently. Smallpox, probably from cows. You have to assume that those people who started living with these animals in some communities all died. Now, when the Europeans came to the New World and brought with them diseases like measles and smallpox and influenza, tuberculosis and so forth, almost everyone in the New World died. Say 70 to 90% of the population. And people I say, it's because they didn't grow up with the animals, and therefore these diseases that have begun by cohabiting with animals, they had not developed a resistance to. But you have to assume that those people in the old world were not born with this resistance, but that there were periods when you had whole societies that probably died from diseases they caught from their animals until they developed an immunity or a strong enough resistance to carry on. So neither the wheat and barley availability nor the access to animals help very much in trying to explain the difference between Old World civilization, New World civilization. Instead of wheat and barley and sheep, goats, and cattle hastening the process of civilization, it appears that the process of civilization was not very hasty. Whereas in areas that did not have those grains and did not have the animals, that is where the process of civilization went in a speedy fashion. If we're dealing here with essentially the interaction of two very simple things. One is an innate desire or inclination of human males to disperse rather than face crowding and conflict. And on the other hand, the consequences of the disappearance of space to disperse to. If you say that the disappearance of space triggers the cultural and economic developments that lead to civilization, and that it happened, vastly faster in the New World than in the Old World, even though it happened earlier in the Old World, then you're edging into an area that is rather interesting, because you're suggesting that that a primary driver of human life on the planet was crowding. That so long as you had new space to move into, hominins did just fine at very low density levels and led comparatively healthful lives that didn't require a whole lot of work to maintain themselves, and had plenty of time left over to, sing songs, invent myths, weave string figures, whatever. But it was only when the space ran out. But if that's the case, then what happens when you start to measure crowding in a more formal way? In other words, if the density for hunters and gatherers is, let us say, hypothetically, 1 per square mile, a figure that's often used by people who are studying foraging communities, then you have a non-coastal community that has, say, 150 people living in it, and it's occupying an area with a radius of somewhat less than 10 miles. So in the course of the year, they go around and they collect this, that, and the other thing, and they kill this, that, and the other thing. 1 person per square mile works pretty well, and your population doesn't grow because the hyenas are always lurking around to eat up your kids. But if crowding then triggers these other things, that crowding may be moving from, let's say, 1 person per square mile to 50 per square mile. Maybe that's enough to get you to start cultivating your own bananas. And then maybe you go to 200 per square mile, or 2,000 per square mile, or God knows what the density is of the Upper West Side of Manhattan, thousands per square mile. Does crowding over the long term in human history create a gradient along which developments in human society and interaction between human societies, along which gradient you can measure things? People have looked at this on a piecemeal basis from time to time. In other words, historical demography will get into the issue of where were the biggest cities in the world and how big were they at a given point in time. One of the most influential demographers for Europe, a man named Josiah Russell, wrote a book on late ancient and medieval populations, in which he we measured densities based on tax records and things like that, and found out that the density of population in medieval France, for example, or England, was way below the density of population in Renaissance Italy or in Flanders during the period of the Northern Renaissance. In other words, when you had concentrated populations, you also often had the flourishing of culture. When you had dispersed populations, not a whole lot happened. You know, Toulouse in the 12th century was a pretty quiet town, whereas Pisa was beginning to move. If you compare these densities on cross-continental basis over time, you might raise a question of are the driving impulses of human history the product of ingenuity, invention, scientific or spiritual thought, or are they more mechanistic things that are triggered by changes in density of population? One thing to keep in mind here is that when the density goes down, then you would expect a regression. Well, of course, this is getting back just briefly to the topic of today's chapter. This is, of course, what happens in the New World. The Europeans come in, they encounter urban societies of great sophistication, although not very impressive armament. They spread diseases that kill 90% of the population. And then the story thereafter becomes the story of what the Europeans do, or the story of what the Africans that the Europeans bring in do. But the story of what the native populations of the world do is dropped. It's dropped because, well, there was no aftermath to the Aztecs. There was no aftermath to the Incas. Their civilizations did not have what it took to grow and prosper and challenge. Why didn't they have what it took? It's because everybody was dead. Once your population drops, I mean, we're talking here, people are estimating that, Mexico goes from 34 million down to a couple of million. You know, the percentages and the hard numbers are difficult to find any consensus on, but the level of population regression is absolutely phenomenal. So what we do is that we say the Europeans conquered the local civilizations, and that was the end of that, without really taking into account the fact that with the disappearance of most of the population, the possibility of continuance had been erased. So you can only speculate as what the continuance might have been, but then you have to compound it with two things. One, the desire of the Europeans to create a life like they had in Europe. And secondly, the active desire of the Europeans to destroy what they encountered. Take an example. There's a plant called amaranth. It grows in Mexico. It was used as a food grain under the Aztecs. It was a popular food grain. If you look up comparative nutritional value, it is ahead of wheat on virtually every index. And it's supposedly tastes real good. The Aztecs would have 1 month of the year in which everybody ate amaranth because it was sacred to the god Huitzilopochtli, who was their a crucial god. And at the end of the month, they would have a big effigy of that guy, and they break it into pieces. It was made out of amaranth seeds. Break it into pieces, everyone eat a bit of the god. Where do we ever hear about eating gods? I don't know. And then you would have the climax of this month of celebration would be human sacrifice. And so the Spaniards came and they said, this god is a demon. We will prohibit the growing of amaranth. So that today, as amaranth is beginning to be rediscovered from wild stock still in Mexico, the fact that this had the potential to be one of the great world food crops was lost because the Spaniards decided it was demonic. So what I'm talking about really is, if you saw the movie Avatar,
yes.
And you combined it with the movie Contagion, so that the beastly humans come to a planet, can only see what they want, impose themselves upon the local people, and then when the local people try and fight back, they all die. That is kind of the story of this chapter, but because we are the descendants of those Europeans, not all of us, but many of us, we celebrate them. And we say, look at what they did. They brought cows. So now we have cows, and they brought wheat. So we can have, beef shawarma with, on pita. We can eat these things that humans want to eat. And then you go to Mexico and you find that, well, actually, thank you, fish tacos on corn tortillas are just fine. The hubris, the assumption of the superiority of Western civilization, you cannot disown it because, in fact, Western civilization ended up on top. But you can certainly ask that the story be told in a way that is more sensitive to the actual historical situation. And the way to do that is to, from the very beginning of your world history course, single out the precociousness of the Western Hemisphere societies in the building of civilization and say, they were not slow, they were not behind. In fact, they scampered along a lot faster than those Egyptians and those Sumerians. So that is the end of today's sermon.